Welcome. Tonight, we will drift quietly into a world shaped by hoofbeats, wide skies, and the creak of saddle leather. A world where cities were built from smoke and canvas, where empires traveled on horseback, and where the rhythms of daily life pulsed in the silence between battles. You are invited to leave the noise of modern life behind for a little while, and step softly into the Mongol Empire, not the one of thunderous charges and burning cities, but the one that whispered, endured, and labored behind the scenes. Here, the most powerful empire in land history was sustained not just by khans and warriors, but by cooks, camp followers, craftsmen, mothers, translators, stable boys, and smiths, many of them forgotten, all of them necessary. This is a journey through dust and yurt, over bone-dry plains and past long-lost capitals. We will not gallop. We will walk, slowly, carefully, through the ordinary lives that made extraordinary conquest possible. Settle in, breathe deeply, let the world around you fade. Let us begin. Imagine the wind, not howling, not roaring, just persistent, whispering across the empty steppe. It's cold, though not bitter. It brushes lightly against your cheeks as you wake in the grey pre-dawn haze. Wrapped tightly in felt blankets, the breath of the others around you rising in soft white clouds. You are in a ger, what some call a yurta, circular tent made of bent wooden slats, covered in layers of thick felt, tied with leather cords and rope. The smoke hole above is closed, but the draft still finds you. You rise slowly, careful not to disturb the others. You are already behind. The warriors expect their breakfast before the sun peaks above the horizon. There's no time for lingering, no time for warmth or idle thought. You wrap a sheepskin around your shoulders, slip your sore feet into stiff leather boots, and step out into the cold. The wind greets you, fully now cool, damp, and faintly bitter with the scent of horse dung and smoke. As a camp attendant in the Mongol army, your life is lived in motion. You go where they go. You serve where they stop. But you are not one of them. You are not a warrior, not a relative of the great khans. You were likely brought in through conquest, staken from a subdued village, spared only because of your youth, your hands, your usefulness. You are not valued for who you are, only for what you do. Your first task is always the same: feed the warriors. You approach the cooking tent, a small ger that functions as a kitchen, if one can call it that. There is a blackened cauldron suspended above cold embers, heavy and greasy from years of use. You gather wood, driftwood, if near a river, dung, if not tanned, light the fire, coaxing it slowly back to life with cautious breaths. The pot must be boiling by the time they rise. Goat meat, or what remains of it, is hacked into chunks, tough, grey, with strings of fat still clinging to the bone. The knife is dull. Your hands are still sore from yesterday. You drop the meat into the pot and ladle water over it, water fetched hours earlier, cracked from the surface of a frozen stream. Your fingers still remember that sting, as the stew simmers. You clean. Saddle tack is scattered near the animal. Pens still crusted with dried blood and mud. You fetch a cloth and a bucket of melted snow and begin scrubbing, not gently, not thoroughly, just enough to pass inspection. The leather must be supple, the reins strong. You cannot let your mind wander. There are rules here, expectations. Miss one step, and you'll feel the lash, or worse, find yourself replaced. Voices begin to rise across the camp. Warriors yawning, coughing, scratching. Someone spits loudly near the latrine trench. Horses snort and jostle. A child cries nearby, then goes silent. The day is beginning. You serve the stew with cracked wooden bowls, filling each just enough to prevent complaint, but never enough to satisfy. The warriors eat quickly, noisily, tossing bones behind them or to the dogs that wait nearby. They do not thank you. They rarely even look at you. You are a ghost in this world, a servant in a realm of conquerors. With breakfast over, the warriors disperse. Some spar, some polish weapons, some simply sit in the morning light, sharpening their knives or chatting softly. You do not linger. Your next tasks await. There is tack to repair, saddles to check, rope to braid. Everything in this camp must move at a moment's notice. The Mongol way is mobility, rapid strikes, sudden marches, endless readiness. You, as an attendant, are part of the machinery that makes that mobility possible. You repair what others break. You carry what they discard. You anticipate their needs before they speak. Mid-morning brings a temporary pause. You are sent to the livestock pens. The sheep have broken part of their enclosure again. You mend it with rope and willow, hands working quickly. Then to the horses, dozens of them, each belonging to a warrior, each more valuable than you. Some are quiet, others bite, kick, or bolt. You whisper to them, try to keep your heartbeat steady. One kicks you hard on the shin. You grit your teeth and limp away. You won't report it. No one would care. You return to your tent briefly. There is no privacy here. You share your space with half a dozen others, attendants, herders, one mute old man who sharpens arrows. It smells of wool, sweat, boiled fat. You sit for a moment, rest your back against the wooden lattice wall, then rise again. Your rest is never long. By noon, the sun is high. The wind has lessened, but the chill remains. You are sent with a group to gather dung fuel for the fire, dried and cracked and brittle. It stains your hands. You no longer notice. You carry it in woven baskets back to the fire pit, then scrub your hands in snow until they are red and raw. Afternoon is the hardest. The day drags. You work under the watchful eye of a steward, mid-ranking Mongol with a horsehair whip and a quick temper. He does not beat often, but he doesn't need to. The threat is enough. You clean the cookpots, sharpen blades, stitch torn canvas. You do not look up unless called. You do not speak unless asked. You wonder, sometimes, what your life would have been had your village never been found. You remember a sister, her name now distant, a father's laugh, the scent of pine. But here, those memories feel like dreams. You are not who you were. You are something different, now something less. As the sun dips low, the temperature drops. Sharply, smoke rises from every tent, coiling into the darkening sky. You light the central fire again. The warriors gather. Some drink, some argue. A storyteller recounts a battle from years ago, bloodless in the telling, almost poetic. You listen from the edge of the circle, knees drawn to your chest. You are not included, but you are near enough to hear. That is enough. Night deepens. The stars emerge sharp and clear in the endless sky. The moon is low and pale. You finish your last task, fetching water for tomorrow. You walk to the river, boots crunching on frost, filled 2 buckets, and return slowly. The world is quiet now. Even the horses sleep back inside your tent. You collapse onto the sleeping mat. There is no pillow, only a folded cloak. You curl around it, listening to the muffled breathing of those around you. Your hands throb. Your back aches. You feel the crust of dust on your face. But you are alive. You have survived another day, and tomorrow you will rise again before the sun, in service to an empire that will never remember your name. And yet, strangely, there is peace in the repetition, the predictability, the endless quiet rhythm of a life bound to others. You are not honored, you are not praised, but you are needed. And in a world of shifting loyalties and endless war, perhaps that is a kind of meaning. Perhaps endurance is its own form of power. As you drift toward sleep, the wind rattles softly against the yurt walls. You close your eyes. Outside, the empire sleeps. And so, now, can you. The man the world would one day know as Genghis Khan was born into uncertainty, in a world where trust was fleeting and survival was measured not in victories but in seasons. He came into being not as a conqueror, not as a Khan, but as a boy, named Temujin, named, so they say, after a captured Tatar warrior his father had just slain, a birth laced already with violence, legacy, and the unquiet murmur of fate. His early years were not gilded. There was no palace, no court, only the rolling sweep of Mongol grassland and the low, smoky warmth of a family yurt. His clan, the Borjigin, was of noble lineage, but prestige on the steppe was no fortress. Power shifted like the wind, and loyalty, like grazing herds, could wander away without warning. Temujin's father, Yesuge, was a chieftain of modest standing, respected but not immune to betrayal. He had enemies, as all men of rank did. One day, as Temujin was still a young boy, his father was poisoned by the Tatars, a rival group his people had long clashed with. The poison took slowly. It worked through his body like smoke through clothensine, but inescapable. When the chieftain died, the family's standing died with him. Temujin was just 9, too young to defend what was theirs, too young to demand loyalty. The family was abandoned by their own clan, cast out, left to wander the steppe on their own. Imagine a boy, barefoot and hollow-eyed, dragging a fishing net behind him as his mother milks a half-starved mare. The fire in their yurt burns weakly. They boil roots, chew bark, live more on grit than on food. Winter comes, and it is long. Temujin's family, his mother Achelin, and his siblings survive through quiet resilience. His mother is strong. She teaches them how to trap animals, how to tan hides, how to endure cold, not by fleeing from it, but by sinking into it, letting it pass through you like breath. She tells them old stories, not to entertain, but to preserve memory. They live without protection, vulnerable to wolves, both the four-legged kind and the ones who ride on horseback. Speaking the language of raids, as Temujin grows older, the pain of that abandonment becomes something sharper, something guiding, a hunger not for food, but for security, for permanence, for control. It begins with friendships, alliances. One of the earliest is with Jamuka, another noble-born boy who rides well, speaks well, and dreams of greatness. They swear brotherhood in a sacred bond, more than friends, less than blood. For a while they are inseparable, but that too would change. In his teens, Temujin marries Bert, a woman from a nearby tribe, the Onjurat. The marriage is more than romantic, it is strategic. It brings temporary allies, new ties. Bert too is strong, patient, wise beyond her years. But not long after their union, Bert is kidnapped by the Merket, a rival tribe who remember old grievances. Against Temujin's family, she is taken in the night, a wife gone, a bond severed. Temujin does not accept this quietly. He rallies what few allies he can, his blood brothers, his half-brothers, some old friends of his father, and strikes. It is his first campaign, and it works. Bert is recovered. She returns, but not unchanged. Months have passed. She is pregnant. The child, Joki, is born into uncertainty. Is he Temujin's son? Perhaps, perhaps not. But Temujin accepts him without question. In a world where blood is a claim and a wound, he makes his choice clear. What follows is a long, slow climb. Temujin begins to attract men not because of family lineage, but because of something else, something quieter and steadier. He shares. Meet equally. He promotes men based on loyalty and merit, not family name. He punishes theft harshly, even among his allies. His rules are firm, his justice swift but even. On the steppe, where betrayal is common and trust is expensive, this is something new. The steppe is not peaceful. Clans jostle for power. Alliances form and dissolve like frost in the sun. Temujin fights, wins, loses, regroups. He breaks with Jamuka, his old blood brother, who now sees him as a rival. They battle more than once. In one conflict, Temujin is defeated, captured. Jamuka executes dozens of his supporters by boiling them alive. A message, brutal and clear. But Temujin survives, regathers, learns. He adapts quickly. He studies the tactics of Chinese generals, the messaging systems of the Uyghurs, the trade networks of the Silk Road. He is not just a warrior, he is a student of empire. In time, the cracks in the old tribal system widen. People grow tired of the endless infighting, the unpredictable loyalties. Temujin's system is discipline, his merit-based ranks, his laws appeals to the desperate, the ambitious, the overlooked. His army grows, not just Mongols, but others, Turks, Tatars, Uyghurs, even some Chinese and Koreans. What binds them is not blood, but order. Around 1206, after years of war and uneasy diplomacy, Temujin calls a great Kurultia council of chiefs and leaders. He is declared Genghis Khan, which does not mean universal ruler, exactly, but something close, oceanic or firm, unshakable leader. It is a name that echoes, not a title given by inheritance, but by force, strategy, and endurance. And yet, even at this moment of triumph, he is not invincible. His body carries old wounds. His back is often stiff. He sleeps poorly, waking in the night to check maps, murmur plans, consult stars. He knows how quickly fortunes shift. He does not trust easily. Even old allies are kept close, but never embraced. From here, the conquests begin, the great campaigns that will stretch from Korea to Poland, from the edges of Siberia to the Persian Gulf. But that is not this story. This story is the one before glory, the road of hunger, of betrayal, of wet boots and cracked lips, of nights without fire and mornings without food. The path of a man who rose not because of birth, but because he refused to fall. Temujin's rise is not one of sudden ascension, but of slow, relentless effort. He loses often, he doubts, he bleeds, but he learns, and in learning, he builds. He is not born a Khan, he becomes one, and that is perhaps what makes him dangerous, not just to his enemies, but to history itself. Because a man who climbs that far from so low, who survives not through heritage, but through adaptation, is not bound by tradition. He is not afraid to reshape the world, not only in his image, but in the image of what he never had, stability, tonight. We remember not the conqueror, not the shadow of empire, but the boy, the son of a poisoned father, the brother of hungry siblings, the husband of a stolen wife, the young man who built his destiny not on inheritance, but on endurance. And as the wind moves softly over the grass, we leave him for now, standing, alone atop a low hill, eyes fixed on the horizon, listening not for praise, but for hoofbeats, for change, for the empire that is yet to come. Close your eyes and imagine an open plain vest, hushed and stretching endlessly toward the pale blue curve of the horizon. There is wind, yes, but not harsh. It moves steadily, like breath across the earth, brushing softly through the tall grasses that sway in slow unison. Far in the distance, mountains cradle the steppe like silent sentinels, their peaks dusted with snow even in summer. In the middle of this sweeping stillness, there once stood a city, not a city of spires or stone towers, not a glittering metropolis like Baghdad or Chang'an. Karakoram was never adorned for the sake of beauty. It was not a city that rose to show off. It was built to function, to anchor a mobile empire, to serve as the quiet heart of a people who never stopped moving. The Mongols had conquered most of the known world, but they did not build cities as others did. Their empire moved with the seasons. Its wealth rested on the backs of horses, and its communications stretched across deserts and rivers through a relay of yurts and riders. And yet, at some point, even a people of motion needed a place to return to, a base, a center. Karakoram became that place. It began humbly. Around 1220, Genghis Khan established a small encampment along the banks of the Orkhan River. The location was strategic. The river provided water and fish. The nearby hills offered timber and protection, and the sweeping plains gave easy access for herds. There had long been settlements, here Turkic traders, Chinese travelers, steppe dwellers, but Genghis wanted something more permanent. He never lived to see it fully built. It was his son, Genghis Khan, who, in the early 1240s, transformed Karakoram from a simple encampment into a capital worthy of an empire. Under Geday's direction, skilled artisans from all corners of the Mongol world were summoned. Chinese engineers, Persian architects, Muslim stonemasons, and Russian carpenters each brought their own knowledge, their own traditions, their own hands to the task. Picture the city now, not in its ruin, but as it once was. The outer walls were made of mud brick, modest by the standards of other empires, but strong enough to demarcate the sacred space within. 4 gates opened toward the cardinal directions, echoing the Mongol worldview, where the world was divided into north, south, east, and west each, with its own significance. Inside, the streets were not wide boulevards, but functional paths just broad enough for a cart or two, lined with stone where necessary, but often just pressed earth, hardened by use. At the heart of the city stood Geday's palace. But palace is a generous word. It was built of stone and timber, more expansive than tall, shaped like a large hall with intricate carvings and a tiled roofer, nod to Chinese design. It was where the Khans met with emissaries, planned campaigns, received tribute, and celebrated victories. Inside, the walls were painted in soft reds and browns, lit by flickering lanterns hung from thick crossbeams. The air would have smelled of horsehide, oiled wood, and the faint trace of incense carried from far-off cities outside the palace. The city buzzed not with crowds or noise, but with purpose. Blacksmiths worked near forges, the ringing of hammer, on iron echoing faintly across the square. Carpenters carved beams. Leatherworkers scraped hides. Traders from India brought spices and cotton. Persian merchants arrived with silk, glass, and knowledge. Russian envoys delivered furs and timber. It was not a metropolis, but it was a crossroads and axis where east met west, where nomad met city dweller, and where a world once fragmented began to feel interconnected. A large silver fountain stood in the city square, reportedly shaped like a tree, crafted by a French artisan named Guillaume Boucher, who had been captured and brought east. From its branches flowed streams of wine, kumis, and fermented mare's milk. Imagine it not as a spectacle, but as a symbol. Wine for the Persians, kumis for the Mongols, and fermented milk for the steppe nomads. A flowing tree in a treeless land, nurturing many roots. Religions, too, found their place in Gidai and his successors welcomed monks, mullahs, priests, and shamans. An Nestorian Christian church stood not far from a Buddhist temple. A Muslim mosque stood close to a Taoist shrine. Here, religion did not divide, coexisted. The Khans were pragmatic, preferring tolerance so long as it did not disrupt order. Tax exemptions were offered to holy men, and debates were sometimes hosted in the palace courtyard not to resolve doctrine, but to entertain the court, and yet, for all its cosmopolitan energy, Karakorum was never truly a Mongol city in spirit. The steppe could not be paved. The wind could not be stopped. The Khans came, but they never stayed long. Their hearts belonged to the saddle. The city served them, but did not define them. Over time, Karakorum grew, but it never swelled beyond modest dimensions. At its height, it may have housed 10,000 people, small by global standards. Still, it had everything an imperial hub required: treasury halls, armories, stables, religious centers, and diplomatic offices. It even had an early form of international postal relay, a place where messages arrived and were sent out in every direction, like spokes on a wheel. But empires shift. Gedi died. Successors quarreled. New centers of power emerged. When Kublai Khan, Genghis's grandson, established the Yuan dynasty and moved the capital to what is now Beijing, Karakorum began to fade. Slowly, inevitably, the city was sacked. In 1388, by Ming dynasty forces, burned, abandoned. What little remained was swallowed by the steppe. Earth-covered stone. The river kept flowing. Winds smoothed the outlines of walls, and time, always the quietest destroyer, did the rest. Today, very little of Karakorum is visible above ground. But beneath the surface, archaeologists have uncovered pieces, foundations, inscriptions, pottery shards, a statue base here, a gate hinge there. In the early 2000s, German and Mongolian teams worked carefully through the layers of dust and soil. They found fragments of Chinese roof tiles, Arabic coins, and Persian ceramics, proof of the city's global reach. Imagine the careful brushstrokes of an archaeologist in silence, brushing away centuries of dust to reveal a smoothed stone floor. The hush of breath held in anticipation. The way the wind still moves, the same way it did 800 years ago, across the same open field. Today, the site of Karakorum is near a small Mongolian town called Karkurin. Nearby stands the Erdene Zoo monastery, built in the 16th century, using stones from the ruins of Karakorum itself. Monks chant in Tibetan script. The walls are lined with prayer wheels. Between them, wildflowers grow. Cows wander through the ancient foundations, unaware of the weight of the history beneath their hooves. And perhaps that is fitting. Karakoram was never about grandeur. It was about function, a place of intersection, a moment when the most mobile people on earth paused, briefly, to build something still. It was never meant to last in stone. Its true legacy is in movement, in connection, in the knowledge that empire can rest, but only for a while before rising again with the wind. So tonight, we remember not just a lost city, but a moment in time. A place where cultures met, not in war, but in conversation. Where a Mongol Khan might drink with a Syrian merchant, while a Chinese artisan carved a roof beam nearby. And as we leave this place, let us carry that stillness with us, a brief pause in the vast breath of history. The city is gone, but the wind remains. Imagine, for a moment, that you are traveling across the broad, flat plains of Western Eurasia. The land seems to stretch forever through what is now southern Russia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. The steppe undulates gently, dotted with sparse trees, wide rivers, and great herds of grazing animals. You ride along an ancient trade route, your horse's hooves muffled by dry grass, your cart creaking beneath silks and furs bound for distant markets. Ahead, faint in the heat haze, rises something unexpected. Not a castle, not a stone-walled city, but a collection of vast, silk-draped yurts glinting in the afternoon sun, arranged in careful formation around a palatial center. You have reached the camp of the Golden Horde. When we think of Mongol power, we often think of conquest of galloping, archers, flaming cities, and thundering hooves. But what followed the conquest, especially in the western territories of the empire, was something different, something surprisingly elegant, rooted in tradition, but colored by luxury. The Golden Horde was not just a military force, it was a refined and complex society, where wealth flowed through caravan routes, and where khans entertained guests with Persian poetry beneath golden canopies. After the initial campaigns that brought the Mongols to Eastern Europe, the western part of the empire was parceled out to Jochi's descendants, Genghis Khan's eldest son. Though Jochi died before his father, his lineage endured, and his son, Batu Khan, became the first ruler of what came to be called the Golden Horde, or Altan Order, a name that evokes splendor as much as control. Their realm was vast, from the edges of the Carpathians to the shores of the Caspian Sea, from the Volga River to the Ural Mountains. It was a land of forests and plains, rivers and deserts. But instead of building great cities, the elite of the Golden Horde built something else: mobility wrapped in wealth. Their camps were not temporary scrambles of tents. They were orchestrated performances of power. The central yurt of a high-ranking Khan was not a rough shelter, but a movable palace, large enough to hold a dozen guests, mounted on wheeled carts drawn by oxen. These yurts were draped in imported silks and layered rugs. The inside was richly appointed. Thick carpets covered the floors, and finely woven hangings lined the walls. Pillows were embroidered with golden thread. Incense burned softly in bronze braziers. The air inside was warm with felt and spice and milk. At the heart of the yurt stood the throne, low, wide, and covered in dyed leather or brocade. The Khan sat with one leg folded beneath him, a golden bowl of fermented mare's milk in hand, flanked by guards in lacquered armor. Behind him, a musician might softly pluck the strings of a marine core, the Mongol horsehead fiddle. The melodies were slow, repetitive, soothing songs of mountains, mothers, and horses lost in storms. Food was abundant, drawn from the riches of the land and the arteries of trade. roast lamb seasoned with cumin from the east, pickled vegetables, traded from Slavic peasants, dried fruits from Samarkand, and honey cakes brought by Armenian merchants. There was kumis, of coarse fermented mare's milk that danced on the tongue with a sharp tang. But there was also wine from Crimea, beer from Rus, and strong distilled spirits from the east. Drinking was ceremonial. A guest was offered. A cup, to refuse, was an insult. To finish it quickly was a mark of honor. And the guests came, oh how they came. It was not just Mongols and steppe tribes who gathered in these courts. Italian merchants from Genoa and Venice brought glass, paper, and coin. Persian diplomats brought books, poems, and finely woven textiles. Byzantine envoys offered icons, amber, and gold. Muslim scholars came with knowledge. Russian princes, under the Khan's tribute system, arrived to show allegiance, bringing furs, slaves, and silver. They bowed deeply, they made their gifts, and they waited for the Golden Horde. Diplomacy was theater. Every meeting, every word spoken, was a performance. The Khan's silence was as meaningful as his speech. A smile might hide judgment. A question might be a test. The horde ruled not only through might, but through subtlety and art of suggestion, of watching, of letting others speak too much while they said very little. And in the background, there was administration, contrary to the image of nomads being disorganized. The Golden Horde maintained one of the most sophisticated tax systems of the medieval world. Their administrators, often Muslim scribes or Turkic clerks, kept detailed records. They imposed Yasa, the Mongol law code, fairly and without distinction of race or religion. Tribute was collected from Russian cities with cold efficiency. Coinage was minted bearing the Khan's tamga, or seal. The economy thrived not, despite their nomadic nature, but because of it. They sat at the center of trade routes, connecting China, India, the Middle East, and Europe. Religion, too, was handled with tolerance and pragmatism. The horde embraced Islam officially in the mid-14th century, particularly under Uzbek Khan. Mosques were built near yurts. Muezzins called the faithful to prayer across the plains. Yet Orthodox Christians, Buddhists, and Jews continued to practice freely. The Khans protected all faiths, so long as they paid taxes and caused no unrest. This tolerance was not born of idealism, but of stability. Peaceful subjects, after all, made for reliable taxpayers. Even the arts found a place. Persian miniature painting was collected in bound manuscripts. Mongol nobles composed verses in Turkish and Persian. Skilled weavers created tapestries that told stories of ancestors, of hunts, of dreams. Some even commissioned historians to record the lineage and deeds of their khans, hoping to capture their legacy in ink. Not just memory, but beneath the silken song, there remained a quiet awareness of the fragility of it all. The horde's luxury was portable, yes, but not immortal. Its stability rested on alliances that could fracture, on trade routes that could shift, on epidemics that could slip in with a caravan. The very mobility that gave them strength could also expose them. A war in China, a famine in Anatolia, a quarrel among heirs each ripple could reach the throne yurt. And so they enjoyed while they could. A day in the life of a Golden Horde noble might begin with the soft shuffle of servants laying out fresh robes, followed by prayers or rituals. At dawn, breakfast might include yogurt, dried berries, and cold meat. The mid-morning might be for receiving envoys or discussing livestock herds with stewards. Afternoons were for hawking riding across the plains with trained falcons or eagles, their cries echoing through the clear air. Evenings brought music, firelight, games of strategy played on wooden boards, and long conversations beneath a wide, star-thick sky. Night would settle over the camp gently. Oil lamps flickered. The wind whispered against the felt walls. Horses slept standing. A few guards walked quietly in circles. The court rested, lulled not by silence, but by the comforting repetition of the ordinary. Outside the circle of yurts, peasants in distant Rus villages whispered about the Mongols about, their wealth, their cruelty, their strange customs. But those who visited the court, who drank the milk, who sat on the carpets and watched the firelight dance on gold-threaded cushions, they carried back a different story. A story not of barbarians, but of aristocrats dressed in wolf, fur, and silk. Of a people who lived in tents, yet ruled kingdoms. Of luxury not bound by stone, but held together by fabric, fire, and the will to endure. Today, little remains of the Golden Horde's grand encampments. Their yurts have long since rotted, their palaces dismantled, their treasures scattered. What survives are coins buried in riverbeds, tombs of khans with fading inscriptions, and the echo of their influence in the languages, laws, and borders of modern Eurasia. But if you stand still on a quiet steppe, somewhere near the lower Volga, as the sun begins to set and the wind picks up a little chill, you might still feel something, a hush, a memory, the faint echo of hoofbeats and laughter, the warm scent of milk on the air, the shadow of a yurt, where once a khan sat, surrounded by luxury waiting, always waiting for the next sunrise, the next visitor, the next horizon. And so we leave them, not at war, but at rest, in comfort, in control, the Golden Horde nomads, in silk, masters of empire, drinking beneath the stars. Let us now turn our gaze from the khans and warriors, the forges and thrones, to a figure less glorified, but no less central in the rhythm of Mongol life, the woman of the steppe. She is not always seen in scrolls or heard in songs. Her name may not echo in the halls of kings, but without her, the empire would have had no heartbeat. Picture her rising in the earliest light, before even the camp's fires are rekindled. The yurt is cool, the coals cold. She stretches quietly, testing the stiffness in her back, then moves to revive the hearth. Her baby, perhaps her fourth, stirs beside her, hungry, fussing. She tucks the infant under a warm wrap of felt and leather, her hands already moving to prepare the morning meal. Her motions are swift, practiced, unhurried. She works as the sky lightens, the walls of her home gently glowing with dawn. This is no palace, and yet this yurt, warm with milk-scented air and soft woolen rugs, is her domain. The man may ride into battle, but she is the keeper of continuity. She weaves the cloth. She chooses which saddle to patch. She decides when the horses are to be moved from one grazing hill to another. And when the time comes to pack up the entire household, she orchestrates it with quiet command. Mongol society, though fiercely hierarchical in warfare, granted its women a remarkable degree of autonomy. Compared to many of their contemporaries, steppe women could own property, initiate divorce, command servants, and even when widowed rule in their husband's stead. They were expected to be strong, resourceful, and above all, adaptable. Marriage, for many, began young. At 12 or 13, a girl might be betrothed, not always by choice, but not always without voice either. These arrangements were more than romantic unions, they were strategic, tying together clans, securing alliances, ensuring herds would be shared rather than fought over. And once married, a woman was not cloistered away. She remained visible. active, and essential. In the daily rhythm of camp life, she performed countless roles. Herding livestock was one of the most time-consuming. Picture her trudging across the open grasslands, a wooden staff in hand, calling softly to sheep and goats. She watches the skies for hawks, the ground for wolf tracks, her children playing nearby, already learning which plants were safe to eat and which to avoid. Her eldest daughter carries a jug of mare's milk. Her son, barely taller than the grass, tries to whistle like the men, failing, laughing. Back at the yurt, she churns the milk, making butter or the slightly intoxicating kummus. She may be unlettered, but she knows the cycles of fermentation, the exact temperature of curdling, the first scent that means spoilage. She can stitch together a saddlebag in a day, or tan leather using nothing but tree bark and patience. Her fingers are stained from dye. Her arms are calloused from lifting water. Her mind is always calculating how much fodder remains, whether a storm will spook the cattle, how to stretch the dried meat through another cold month. And yet, her world is not only practical, it is spiritual. The Mongol woman often served as the keeper of the family's spiritual life. She might leave offerings at the sacred overdose, cairns of stones and bones, raised to honor the spirits of land and sky. She would know the right day to light incense, the right chant to whisper when a child fell ill. Shamans, often women themselves, were intermediaries between the seen and unseen. They carried bells, feathers, and iron mirrors. They read dreams and danced under moonlight to the thump of drums. At festivals, women dressed with care, silver, earrings dangled from their ears. Their hair was braided elaborately, wound with beads and ribbons. Their Deal's traditional robes were embroidered with patterns passed down from mother to daughter. These garments were not frivolous. They told stories. A mountain on the sleeve might represent her mother's birthplace. A circle of dots might recall a comet scene when she was a girl. Even in beauty, there was memory, when the warriors returned. From campaign, the women were ready not as passive recipients, but as stewards of home. They had kept the herds alive, the children healthy, the stories preserved. They prepared hot soup, mended wounds, asked no questions. Some had buried fathers or sons in their absence. They grieved quietly, marked the grave with a carved stick, and kept going. There was always work to do, and sometimes, though less often, she fought. If the camp was threatened, if the men were away, the women defended what was theirs. They knew how to shoot a bow, how to ride, how to swing a blade. In desperate defense, there are chronicles usually brief of women who took up arms, commanded warriors, even governed regions. Sorgatani Beki, the mother of Kublai Khan, was one such figure. A skilled diplomat, fluent in multiple languages, she negotiated tribute, oversaw estates, and quietly shaped the course of imperial history behind the curtain of male ambition. But most women of the steppe were not queens or warriors. They were workers, endurers, quiet masters of their landscape. They lived not in isolation, but in constant cooperation with kin, with animals, with land. Every task was communal, every hardship shared. When illness came, they brewed herbal broths. When famine loomed, they made tough decisions, slaughtering beloved animals, rationing flour. When spring arrived, they cleaned the camp, rearranged the yurts, rethreaded their lives for another year. Their lives were not soft. Childbirth was dangerous. Winters were long. Political shifts like the death of a Khan or a border war could throw everything into uncertainty. But women carried these burdens as they did everything else without choice, but not without strength. At night, the yurt was quiet. A low lamp flickered. The children slept close, warm under furs. She sat cross-legged, sewing by feel rather than sight, her thoughts drifting. She remembered her mother's hands, the voice of a sister now married into another clan, the way her father had smelled of smoke and grass, the hum of songs sung while milking in early morning fog. Sometimes, if the night was very still, she would hum a lullaby, old and thin, meant only for the baby on her back. The melody carried no words, just a sound, low and even, like the wind through the tall steppe grass. Tomorrow would come soon, the same work, the same tasks, but also small joys, warm meal, a child's laughter, the sight of distant herds returning safely. And so we remember her not just as a wife or mother, not merely a background figure, but as the quiet architect of Mongol endurance. Without her, there would be no warriors to ride, no khans to rule, no empire to stretch across continents. She was the one who stayed behind and kept the world from falling apart. The sun rises slowly, as it always has, casting a dusty gold light over your city's stone walls and wooden gates. Merchants are just beginning to arrange their stalls. Bakers stoke their fires. Children sweep the temple steps. It is an ordinary morning, familiar, comforting. But somewhere, just beyond the hills, something is approaching. Something unfamiliar, silent at first, but relentless. Within hours or days you will understand what has come, but by then, it will be too late. To be conquered by the Mongols was to have your world rewritten out gradually, not politely, but all at once. One day, you lived in a town with its own rules, its own rhythms, its own gods. The next, the gates had been broken, the air choked with smoke, and the future reshaped under a sky that now seemed too big, too empty, too indifferent to care. The Mongols came with speed. That was always the first and most terrifying thing. Armies in the medieval world moved slowly. A week's march here, a month's siege there. But the Mongols, they did not creep. They galloped. They arrived before you could prepare. They struck from angles you didn't expect. Their horses could ride twice the distance of others in a single day, and their archers fired from the saddle with deadly precision. They did not bellow threats. They did not give long speeches. They simply arrived. Imagine being a farmer outside the city walls, watching from the fields as the horizon begins to darken, not with clouds, but with dust kicked up by hooves. At first, it is hard to tell what you're seeing. A flock of birds, a storm. Then you spot them lines of riders, spaced wide, disciplined, armored in layers of lacquer and fur, their flags fluttering in the wind. They do not chant, they do not roar, they just move, and the fields around you suddenly feel far too open. If your town or city surrendered immediately without resistance, your fate might not be as grim. The Mongols valued obedience, not defiance. They preferred to absorb rather than destroy when it suited their plans. In such cases, they would demand hostages, important family members, city officials, sometimes children of the elite. These were not killed, they were ensures. A guarantee that taxes would be paid, orders followed, and loyalty maintained. Your town would be taxed, yes heavily, but not erased. But if your leaders refused, if pride or miscalculation led to defiance, then the siege began. It could last days or weeks. The Mongols studied siegecraft with quiet patience. From Chinese engineers They learned to build catapults, battering rams, and siege towers. They tunneled under walls. They diverted rivers. They studied weaknesses. Your defenses, once reliable, would suddenly seem porous. You would see rocks the size of barrels crashing into rooftops. Watch your neighbors scatter as fire arrows rained. Down, water supplies poisoned, food dwindling, morale withering. And then, one morning, you would wake to silence. No arrows, no movement, no riders in the hills. At first, you might feel hope, relief. But then the gates creak open. Not by your own guards, but by those who have betrayed you or been bought. And the Mongols enter, slowly, methodically, in rows. What follows is not chaos, not madness. It is strangely orderly, chillingly calm. Those who resist are cut down without ceremony. Leaders are brought to the center square, sometimes executed in public, sometimes not. Those who hide are dragged from homes, temples, cellars. Fires are lit, but not wildly. Mongols didn't destroy indiscriminately unless it served a purpose. They were sending a message. This is what happens when you resist. And then came the accounting. The Mongols were meticulous. After a city was taken, scribes and clerks tallied the population. Craftsmen, blacksmiths, stonemasons, weavers were often spared and relocated. They might be sent east to work on Mongol weapons or yurts, or west to repair bridges or construct siege tools. Doctors, astrologers, and translators were also kept. The rest, merchants, monks, peasants, officials, were judged as useful or not. Sometimes, entire populations were marched out and divided. Men to one side, women and children to another. The useful were incorporated, the others disappeared. Not always through slaughter, often through dispersal, re-enslavement, forced migration. They simply vanished from the record, absorbed into the machinery of empire. And what of your home? Your temple, your memories, gone, or worse, occupied. Temples were sometimes looted, statues defaced, scrolls burned. Not always from hatred, but from indifference. The Mongols were not ideologues. They had no interest in erasing your gods unless your gods had defied them. Then, symbols were smashed as warnings. Your home might now house a Mongol officer. Your language replaced by Turkic or Mongol commands. Your name mispronounced or forgotten. You still exist, but in the margins. And yet, strangely, life continued. The Mongols, once satisfied with conquest, rarely lingered in cruelty. After the shock, after the punishment, came the rules. Taxation systems were imposed. Governors, often locals, loyal to the khans, were installed. Roads were repaired. Markets reopened. Trade resumed. You could sell again, buy again, walk the streets again, but nothing felt the same. There was no celebration, no holidays, just work, survival, memory. In the years that followed, you might see changes that felt surreal. Venetian merchants, speaking broken Persian, arriving to trade glassware for wool. Muslim scholars, debating Buddhist monks in the town square. Mongol messengers galloping through the city with passports marked by the imperial seal. The world had opened, but not by invitation, by imposition. Your city might thrive again, but it would be under the watchful eye of officials you did not choose. And every year you would pay tribute, not just in silver, but in obedience. The Mongols rarely tolerated a second mistake. You resisted once. You would not resist again, and so a strange stillness settled over the conquered. A new order, efficient, ruthless, but strangely stable. You lived, you adapted. Your children learned new languages. Your calendar changed. Festivals shifted. Maps were redrawn. You became, slowly, something else. Neither free nor enslaved. Not defeated, but reshaped. And yet, at night, when the fires burned low and the wind carried across the plains, the stories were still told. Stories of the day the riders came, of the thundering hooves, the silence before the breach, the red banner, snapping in the wind, the archers, masked and faceless, the temple bells drowned in smoke, the old names, and the one thing that could not be taken, memory. Begin with the sound of wind, not a gust, not a storm, just the steady hush of it sweeping through open grass. The sky is enormous, pale blue, without end. Beneath it, the land rolls in low, endless waves, patched with scrub and rough grass, dotted with distant black specks that move. As you draw closer, you see them. Horses, dozens, hundreds, moving in loose groups across the plains, ears flicking hooves, stamping, manes tangled by the wind. In the world of the Mongols, there was no animal more essential, more ever-present, more deeply woven into life than the horse. Not just a means of transportation, not merely a beast of burden. The horse was life itself, and yet to call it a companion or a pet would be a mistake. These animals were not doted upon. They were relied upon, respected, feared at times, but never softened with sentiment. A Mongol child began riding as soon as they could walk. By the age of 3 or 4, they were perched on small, sturdy horses, gripping coarse manes instead of reins, learning balance with the help of wind and repetition. There was no saddle at first, only bare backs, rough wool, and trust in instinct. A fall was expected. A bruise was common. The steppe did not offer cushions, only experience. The Mongol horse itself was not elegant by the standards of other lands. It was short, rarely, more than 13 hands high, broad of chest, thick-necked and shaggy, but its seeming awkwardness concealed power. These horses were bred for endurance, not beauty. They could gallop for hours, survive on frozen grass, drink from icy streams, and sleep standing in howling winds. They were not stabled, they were not pampered. They lived as their riders did, exposed, adaptable, and unbreakable. Each warrior in the Mongol army rode with several horses, not just one. A typical soldier might have 3, 5, even 10 mounts. This allowed them to switch horses mid-march, preserving stamina. It also ensured that if one fell, another was ready. The Mongols moved with terrifying speed, covering distances other armies could not imagine, because they moved like the wind on horseback, never slowed by tired legs. But these horses were more than transportation. They were a source of nourishment. A Mongol could, in times of scarcity, slice a vein in the horse's neck and drink its blood warm, iron-rich, and life-sustaining. The wound was sealed afterward, and the horse continued on. This was not cruelty, it was survival, and the horses, too hard living, endured it without panic. Their milk, too, was vital. Mur's milk, when fermented, became Kumisa's central drink in the Mongol diet. Sharp, slightly sour, gently intoxicating. It nourished both body and soul. Herding the mares, milking them, fermenting the liquid, it was all part of daily life. A Mongol household could not function without a steady supply of horses. They were not pets, they were providers. The relationship between horse and rider was built on familiarity and function. There was no indulgent stroking of manes, no naming of animals like children. The horse was broken in with discipline, trained with firm guidance. Rewards were minimal, often just rest. Praise, if given, was quiet, offered in the form of a loosened rein or a short ride home. If a horse spooked or refused to obey, it was not coddled. It was corrected. Yet despite this hardness, there was a deep, silent bond. A warrior would often speak to their horses not with affection, but with purpose. Short commands, low whistles, a murmur in the darkness before battle. The horse listened, knew the voice, trusted it. In return, the rider knew the animal's rhythm, could feel a limp before it showed, could sense unease before the herd stirred. A good warrior did not just ride, they moved with the horse, adjusting weight, reading signals, becoming a single form at full gallop. Imagine a battle now. A dust-choked plain, arrows flying, shouts rising. A Mongol rider, crouched low over the saddle, releases a shaft while at full speed. The horse beneath him does not stumble, does not flinch. It turns, as instructed, pivoting on one hoof, while the rider notches another arrow. Together, they are a weapon. Fluid, lethal, coordinated through months, years of shared discipline. Even in death, the horse remained bound to the rider. In burial mounds across Mongolia, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of ritual horse burials. A warrior's favorite mount might be sacrificed and placed beside him to serve in the afterlife. Saddles, bridles, even milk vessels were buried. Two echoes of life preserved in death. The mourning was not loud, but the message was clear. Where the rider goes, the horse must follow. But life with horses was not only about war. In peaceful times, the horses grazed freely. They formed herds that ranged for miles, guided by women and children during seasonal migrations. Herding them was an art. A child with a long stick and a steady voice could steer dozens at once. At night, the horses were hobbled 2 legs, lightly tied, so they could not wander too far. But they were rarely penned in. The steppe was their fence, their home in spring when foals were born. The camp quieted for a moment. There was care, then guarding against wolves, against disease. The young horses learned quickly. Within weeks, they ran with the herd, their legs long and awkward, their manes already lifting in the breeze. They did not need taming yet. That would come in time. Children learned the songs that guided herds. Low, almost humming, tunes carried by the women, sung at dusk. These were not lullabies. They were instructions, warnings, reassurance. To the horse, it was all the same. Music in the wind, as old as the grass itself. In camp, the horses were part of every task. Their hides became ropes and boots, their bones, tools, their hair, thread, their dung, fuel. Even their sweat was nonits, sent a marker of effort, of distance, of time passed under sun and saddle. Mongols lived in the rhythm of hooves, counted journeys in days of riding, measured strength by how long one could remain mounted without tiring. And there was fear, too. A frightened horse could kill without meaning to. One kick could shatter ribs. A misstep at speed could send a rider flying. Mongols respected this. They did not romanticize it. The horse was power, untamed, generous, but not gentle. It gave but on its own terms. No Mongol would ever call a horse a pet. To do so would be to misunderstand the relationship entirely. A pet could be replaced. could be indulged. A horse was part of the family, but also apart from it. A partner, but not a peer. It was not owned so much as joined in the evenings. When the campfires flickered and the wind died down, the horses would gather, heads lowered, eyes half-lidded, breathing in slow rhythm. Their bodies cast long shadows in the firelight. A few children would lie beside them, curled into the curve of a flank, warm against the night air. The horses would not move, not until morning. And so we remember them not as symbols, not as ornaments of war, but as living beings at the very center of Mongol life, as companions in conquest, as providers in peace, creatures of endurance, not elegance, shaped by wind and distance and need, not pets, but partners, always in motion, always just beyond the edge of the firelight, listening, waiting, ready. Picture the steppe again, not as a battlefield, not as a pasture, but as a highway, a long, invisible network stretching from the edge of the Yellow Sea all the way to the Danube. No pavement, no signs, just grass, dust, and direction. Yet across this emptiness moved messages with astonishing speed, orders, reports, intelligence, trade agreements, news of births and deaths, secrets, all of it moving on horseback, carried by a system the Mongols called the Yam. To understand the Mongol Empire is to understand motion. Nothing in it stayed still for long, least of all information. An empire that stretched over 9,000 kilometers could not be governed by brute force alone. What Genghis Khan and his successors built was more than an army. It was a logistical marvel, a living network of people, animals, stations, and signals that allowed a message sent in Karakoram to reach Bukhara, Baghdad, or even Kiev in a matter of days. At the heart of this system was the Yam, sometimes translated as relay, route, or simply post. It was not a single road, but a web, decentralized, overlapping structure that crisscrossed the empire. Along this network, stationed at regular intervals, usually about 25 to 30 miles apart, were rest stops called Yam stations, or gagege. At each one waited fresh horses, food, shelter, and men trained to assist couriers. These were not mere way stations, they were the nervous system of empire. Imagine you are a rider, a courier of the Mongol state. You ride alone, cloaked in wool, a satchel of documents strapped to your chest. The wind cuts at your face, the saddle creaks, but you do not stop. Ahead lies another station's, more round, thatched or felt-roofed, half hidden in the grass. You dismount, barely slowing. A new horse is ready. You drink water, pass the message forward, or mount again and continue. Within minutes, you are riding again, and thus messages flew. Some riders traveled incredible distances in record time. It's said a message could travel nearly 200 miles in a day. This was not a legend, it was logistics. The Mongols maintained thousands of horses at Yam stations across the empire. They planned routes meticulously, recorded distances, and made sure supplies were always available. The success of the Yam was not in its glamour, but in its reliability, and to support it, the Mongols taxed the lands carefully. Local populations were required to contribute to the system fodder, food, labor. These obligations were tracked in detailed records. You might be a farmer living near a Yam station. Every week, you're expected to bring hay. Once a month, a chicken. Twice a year, you might be asked to help repair the walls or reinforce the corrals. It was a burden, but a manageable one. And in exchange, the system worked. Couriers carried not only letters, but also good silk, medicines, sacred relics, spices, sometimes people, envoys, priests, even spies. And at the heart of the yam's function was a document called the paisa, tablet or medallion made of gold, silver, or wood, depending on rank. It was stamped with the seal of the Khan, and it granted the bearer safe passage and authority. With a paisa, you could command fresh horses, demand shelter, and expect obedience. Without it, you were just another traveler. With it, you were the voice of the state. The paisa was treated with reverence and fear. To misuse it was a grave crime. If you carried one, you were expected to move swiftly, report truthfully, and behave with discipline. Abuse the privilege, and you might find yourself removed from the network, banished, punished, or worse. But within the system, life was structured and fair. Yam station keepers called yamchi were appointed based on reliability. They were usually locals, but often supervised by imperial agents. They lived simple lives, maintaining stables, keeping records, cooking meals, repairing roofs. Their job was not glamorous, but it was vital. And in return, they received exemptions from certain taxes, modest pay, and occasional imperial favors. In many ways, the yam resembled an early form of government-sponsored infrastructures, centuries ahead of its time. The Roman roads had long since crumbled. Europe's feudal kingdoms lacked consistency. China had postal systems, but even they paled in scale. The Mongols, riding through a continent, managed to maintain not just an army, but communication, and they understood that control of information meant control of power. Imagine Kublai Khan, in his court in Dadu, modern Beijing, reading a report just days old from the far western front, a border skirmish in Persia, a change of leadership in Samarkand, the death of a Rus prince. These were not distant events. They were actionable, immediate. The yam erased distance. It allowed the empire to think as one mind, and it allowed travelers foreign and domestic to move with unexpected safety. Marco Polo, the Venetian traveler, marveled at the Mongol postal system. In his travels through Yuan China, he encountered yam stations frequently, noting their efficiency and scale. He wrote of how a traveler could rely on the network not just for speed, but for food, shelter, and even security. Robbery, so common on other trade routes, was almost non-existent along the yam. The punishment was too severe, the message too important. There were variations, of course. Some routes were more primitive, others well-developed. In mountainous areas, horses gave way to mules. In deserts, camels took their place. In swampy zones, boats bridged the gaps. The network flexed with the landscape, adapted with climate. Its genius was not in uniformity, but in responsiveness. And then, of course, there were the messages themselves. Some were military orders, dispatches, instructing generals to shift troops, to strike, to retreat. Others were trade documents, licensing caravans, adjusting tariffs, reporting shortages. Many were diplomatic letters from one khanate to another, from a Mongol princess married into a distant court, from a foreign king seeking alliance. Some were personal, a son reporting the health of his father, a merchant announcing the birth of a child, a widow seeking her inheritance from across the empire. All of it moved, tirelessly, quietly, day and night. The yam system, in its peak, knit the empire together not by loyalty, but by speed. It did not care who was in power, so long as messages flowed. It was not sentimental, it was not grand, it was functional. and in that function it was brilliant. But like all things, it faded as the empire fractured, dividing into khanates. The yam lost cohesion. One branch still functioned, another withered. Corruption crept in, roads became unsafe, funds misallocated, local wars made the network unpredictable. By the late 14th century, what had once been a seamless web was now a tattered string of disconnected threads, and yet ever no traces remain in Central Asia. Old way stations sit in ruined mounds of stone, circular outlines, weathered troughs. In Mongolian folklore, riders still whisper about the spirits of the fast couriers, restless souls who galloped too far, too fast, and vanished into the wind. And in modern infrastructure, echoes of the yam live in post offices, in express services, in networks that promise speed across impossible distance. So tonight, as you imagine the grasslands stretching outward under a full moon, picture a lone rider cloaked against the cold, his breath misting, his horse quickening, a message in his satchel sealed with wax, stamped with the mark of empire. He will not sleep, he will not stop. His journey is not his own, and somewhere far away, another hand waits to receive his message. The sea between Korea and Japan is calm, now silken and pale, barely rippling in the early light. A few fishing boats drift near the shore, their sails slack. In the distance, mist clings to the water like breath. It is quiet, but if you listen closely, you might still hear echoes, hooves that never made landfall, commands shouted across the surf, and the roar not of battle, but of wind, a wind that changed the course of empires. This is the story of the Mongol invasion of Japan, or rather, of two invasions, two attempts by the greatest land power the world had ever known to conquer an island they had never touched, and of the force that stopped them, an army, not a wall, but the sea itself. It begins with Kublai Khan. By the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire had fractured into khanates, but it was still vast. Kublai, grandson of Genghis, ruled the east from the heart of China to the coasts of the Pacific. He had declared himself emperor of the Yuan dynasty, seated in a grand capital at Dadu, modern-day Beijing, and he was not content. His eye turned eastward to the islands beyond the sea. Japan, at this time, was not united in the way we might imagine. The emperor still existed, but true power lay with the shogunate, the military government headquartered in Kamakura. The samurai class was dominant. Clans feuded. Yet, even in their division, the Japanese were aware of the Mongol shadow falling across the continent. In 1266, Kublai sent envoys to Japan, courteous letters, polite commands. He invited warned the Japanese shogun to submit, recognize the Yuan as overlords, send tribute, join the order of things. The Japanese did not respond. Letters followed, more envoys, more silence, and eventually the Mongols grew impatient. In 1274, Kublai launched his first invasion. He gathered a fleet on the southern Korean coast, nearly 900 ships, filled with Mongol soldiers, Chinese conscripts, and Korean sailors. Around 15,000 troops in total, supported by another 8,000 Korean warriors. The armada was a patchwork of languages, weapons, loyalties, and discomfort. Many of these men were not volunteers. They were pressed into service. Farmers turned sailors, merchants turned archers, but they followed orders. The journey across the sea was brief but difficult. The vessels were not built for ocean travel. They were flat-bottomed riverboats, vulnerable to waves, cumbersome in storms. Still, the fleet reached the shores of Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's main islands. There, the Mongols met the samurai. What followed was stranger clash of styles, of assumptions, of rhythm. The Mongols fought in tight units, using coordinated arrow volleys, drums to signal commands, and smoke bombs to disrupt formations. The Japanese, accustomed to duels and individual valor, found this overwhelming. Their horses were smaller, their armor different, their tactics bold, but disorganized, were ill-suited to this kind of enemy. For days, skirmishes erupted near Hakata Bay. The Mongols advanced inland, burning villages, capturing forts. But they didn't stay. After a few days, the fleet re-embarked, possibly to regroup, possibly forced by supply issues. That night, as they waited on their ships, the wind shifted, a storm rolled, insodden, fierce, and unrelenting. Waves rose. Winds screamed. The ships, already unstable, smashed against one another. Sailors were flung into the sea. Arrows were useless. Anchors snapped. The fleet scattered. Hundreds of vessels sank. Thousands of men drowned. Some washed ashore disoriented, exhausted, captured. Others vanished into the depths. Japan called it divine intervention. Kamikaze, divine wind, a sign from the gods that the land was protected. But Kublai Khan did not believe in omens. He believed in preparation. He waited, planned, and in 1281, 7 years later, he returned. This time, the invasion was far larger. 2 fleets were assembled, one in Korea, one in southern China. Together, they would carry nearly 140,000 men, an almost unimaginable number for the time. Tens of thousands of ships, supplies, weapons, siege engineers, translators. Kublai spared. No expense, but the Japanese had also prepared. In the years since the first invasion, they had fortified their shores, built stone walls along the beaches of Hakata Bay, improved communication between provinces, reorganized the samurai response. This time, they were ready. The 2 Mongol fleets converged off the coast of Kyushu, but delays dogged them. The Korean fleet arrived early. The southern Chinese ships lagged. Coordination was poor. The Mongols established a beachhead, but could not break the defenses. Days passed, then weeks. The Japanese used small boats to attack at night, harassing the anchored. Invaders. Disease spread. Supplies ran low. Morale frayed. And then, once again the wind came. A second great storm. This one even more violent than the last. It raged for 2 days. Ships were driven onto rocks. Hulls cracked. Sailors panicked. Horses drowned, still tied to planks. Men clung to wreckage, shouting for gods in a dozen different tongues. Some tried to flee. Others died where they stood. By the time the storm passed, over half the fleet was destroyed. Survivors limped back to the mainland. Many never made it. Those who did carried stories, not just of battle, but of chaos. Of a land that would not be taken, not by force, not by sea. Kublai Khan did not attempt a third invasion. Japan remained unconquered. But what was left behind was not just wreckage, was memory. On the beaches of Kyushu, villagers picked through. Splintered ships, foreign helmets, arrowheads, sails torn like silk, bodies buried in shallow graves or washed out to sea. The invincible Mongol army had reached their shores and been turned away, not by swords, but by storms. The idea of kamikaze became legend. More than weather, a sign, a promise. It entered the cultural soul of Japan, a reminder that some forces cannot be bent, that some places are meant to remain untouched. And yet, from the Mongol perspective, the story is more complicated. The invasions were not reckless. They were ambitious, yes, but also logical. Kublai sought to integrate Japan into the greater trade network, to secure the eastern edge of his empire, to stabilize shipping lanes. And he nearly succeeded. Had the winds not come, history might have turned. Japan could have been changed, not erased, but altered. Mongol influence might have introduced new trade, new customs, new scripts. But the storm closed that door today. Archaeologists still uncover remnants of the invasion's armor, weapons, even ship timbers buried beneath silt. In Imari Bay, divers explore underwater wrecks. In coastal shrines, offerings are left to the wind gods. In museums, a page carried by a Mongol emissary sits behind glass, its characters faded, its authority long gone. But the story remains, not of conquest, but of limits. Even the most powerful empire, with the most feared army, could be humbled by weather, by chance, by geography. And in the quiet that followed the storms, both sides returned to their rhythms. The Mongols rode westward. Again, the Japanese rebuilt their villages, and the sea, as always, kept its secrets. Let us walk now into a place few ever saw, and fewer still truly understood. The court of the great Khan, not a palace in the conventional sense, not a Versailles, or a forbidden city. Not marble columns or gilded gates, but a movable court, sometimes seated in Karakoram, sometimes in Shangdu or Dadu, and sometimes nowhere fixed at all. A court that changed with the seasons, that moved with the rhythms of an empire stretched across 2 continents. A court shaped not by stillness, but by control. Step through the entryway, whether it be a felt curtain or a lacquered arch, and listen. Silence at first, then the gentle murmur of languages: Persian, Arabic, Chinese, Mongolian, Turkic, Russian, Latin, a dozen tongues spoken in lowered voices by men and women gathered from every corner of the known world. Ambassadors, emissaries, scholars, monks, merchants, all brought here to wait, to observe, to be observed. Inside the Khan's audience, hollow or great tent, depending on the era there is symmetry and protocol. The air smells faintly of sandalwood and boiled mutton. Rich rugs from Samarkand cover the floor. Painted screens line the walls, their lacquered surfaces catching the soft flicker of oil lamps. At the center, slightly elevated, sits the Khan, himself expression unreadable, posture unhurried. He does not speak first. Around him stand his secretaries, advisors, translators. Some are trusted companions, others newly arrived. All are alert. Nothing happens here without being noted. A cough, a hesitation, a glance held too long, everything is recorded, if not on parchment, then in memory. The court is a place of theater, but not showmanship. There are no grand performances, no orchestras or choreographed welcomes. There is protocol, instead layers of ritual and tone. Every emissary bows differently, depending on rank. Every gift is presented with a specific gesture. Missteps are not corrected aloud. They are simply noted and remembered. Gifts are crucial. They are currency. Not merely offerings, but messages wrapped in silk. A jewel-encrusted sword from a Georgian prince says one thing. A sacred relic from a Tibetan monastery says another. Even the absence of a gift says something. The Khan reads the unspoken just as fluently as the written, and it is not only the Khan who is watching. Among the attendants are spies not in disguise, but in plain view. Men and women whose job is not to serve tea, but to listen. They monitor the envoys, the guards, even one another. They memorize names. They count footfalls. They eavesdrop without appearing to listen. Some work for the Khan. Others report to regional governors. A few answer to foreign powers. In the Khan's court, information is a tide that flows in all directions. Diplomacy here is slow by design. It unfolds over days. A message is delivered and a response delayed. The emissary waits, often in isolation, their movements gently restricted, their conversations carefully arranged. They are offered hospitality, fine meals, music, warm rooms, but not freedom. Every question they ask is echoed back. Every answer they give becomes part of a growing profile. The Mongol intelligence network, known broadly as the Jago, extends far beyond the court. Spies are embedded along trade routes, inside enemy courts, within religious orders, and among merchant guilds. Information moves quickly. A plot in Delhi might be known in Karakoram within a fortnight. A diplomatic overture in Damascus might be met with a Puritan reply days later. The Khan's court, then, is not only a place of decision, it is a place of collection, a node in a vast web of knowledge. It functions less like a throne room, and more like an intelligence nerve center, and at the center sits the Khanofan silent, always calculating. Kublai Khan, for example, was known to conduct court in the Chinese style, seated on a low platform surrounded by ministers of multiple backgrounds, Confucian scholars, Buddhist monks, Nestorian Christians, Muslim astronomers. He listened more than he spoke. Delegations from across Eurasia brought him news, and he remembered all of it. He tested people, asked questions whose answers he already knew, introduced delays to observe impatience, smiled politely at lies, and always, quietly, he gathered. Even before Kublai, his predecessors, Gidai, Mungai, and Gyak, relied on courts not to rule, but to filter. They saw in the court not just a political space, but a strategic one. Here they could measure rivals without drawing swords. Here they could signal dominance through gifts, through posture, through mere presence. Consider this: a Persian emissary bows before the Khan, presenting a tribute of gold and books. His hands shake slightly. He has been riding for weeks. His clothing is dusty. Yet, within a few hours of his arrival, the Khan already knows the state of the Persian treasury, the health of its armies, the recent scandal involving its vizier, and even what the emissary's brother said in Baghdad last winter. This is not magic. This is the network, and it extends inward as well. Even within the court itself, loyalty is a fluctuating currency. Courtiers rise and fall not through bloodline alone, but through performance. A talented scribe may become a senior advisor. A veteran general might find himself reassigned to a distant province if he becomes too popular. The court is always shifting. A whisper here, a reshuffling there. Punishments are rare, but precise. A cup of tea left untouched. A summons not delivered. An invitation rescinded. And sometimes, simply, disappearance. But the court is not only shadow, it is also conversation, debate. Vision. Here, policies are born about taxation, about military campaigns, about trade routes. A new governor is appointed in Transoxiana. A marriage arranged between a Mongol princess and a Rus prince. A decree issued protecting foreign merchants. a calendar adjusted to include a festival borrowed from Buddhist traditions. Religion, too, is negotiated here. The Mongol court is uniquely tolerant, welcoming imams, monks, and priests. The Khan listens to them all. Some convert to Islam, others support Buddhism. A few lean toward, but official policy remains the same. Belief is personal, taxes are not. And always, diplomacy weaves through it all. Envoys from the Pope arrive with Latin letters and jeweled crosses. They are treated with courtesy, but their questions are not always answered. Instead, they are offered observations, questions in return. A Persian astronomer is summoned to demonstrate a new model of the heavens. A Chinese engineer unrolls plans for an irrigation system. An Armenian scribe presents a map painted on leather. In this court, curiosity is power, knowledge a form of tribute, and then, sometimes, the Khan speaks. His voice is low, measured. The room stills. He may ask a question, issue a verdict, or dismiss the gathering with a single nod. Then he rises, steps into the shadows behind the curtain, and the audience is over. The court does not empty all at once. Conversations resume softer now. Notes are passed, glances exchanged. A new hierarchy begins to take shape. The emissaries will return to their quarters, wondering what was gained, what was lost. And outside, the world moves on. Messengers ride westward with fresh instructions. Scrolls are copied in quiet chambers. Spies record new rumors. The court will reconvene tomorrow, with new faces, new calculations, but the same careful silence. So, remember this. The court of the Khan was not built of walls and columns. It was built of words, of silences, of eyes that noticed, ears that never rested. It was not a place of performance. It was a place of pressure. And in that pressure, history was shaped. Before the fires are even lit, before the horses are fed, before the first arrow is notched, the blacksmith is awake. His fingers move stiffly at first. The night was cold, always is, this far from the cities. He rolls his shoulders, stands slowly, and steps out of the yurt into a pale, violet dawn. The wind on the steppe is gentle now, but it carries the faint promise of another dry, dusty day. There is already the smell of animal dung, of crushed grass, of a camp not yet moving but not quite still. And always, behind it all, the heavy scent of iron still clinging to him from yesterday's work. He does not wear silk or furs. His clothes are thick wool, patched and worn, stiff with ash and sweat. His hands are calloused, fingers slightly bent from long days of grip and hammer. He walks without ceremony to the forger low domed structure near the center of the mobile camp. Not a permanent building. Nothing here is, but it has been set up well. Stones ring the hearth. A bellows lies coiled like a resting beast. Buckets of water, tubs of charcoal, bars of raw iron, all wait in place. This is not a workshop of elegance. It is one of necessity. He begins by checking the tools' tongs, hammers, chisels, punches. Each is touched, checked for cracks, balanced in hand. He lays them out with the care of a surgeon preparing for a long, unbroken procedure. The forge must be ready before the first soldier arrives, before the first broken stirrup is carried. In the first dulled blade, the first snapped bridle hook. It is not glory he serves. It is continuity. By the time the sun crests the hills, the fire is glowing. The bellows are worked with steady rhythm. Puff, pause, puff. The coals respond. Crackling, glowing orange, then white hot. Sparks leap like insects. He feeds the fire carefully, layering fuel, adjusting air, waiting for the precise moment when the heat is right, not too early, not too late. The metal will tell him when it's ready. It always does. His first task today is simple, but essential. Arrowheads. Each must be identical. Not too long, not too thick. Just enough to pierce through armor, but light enough to fly true. He heats the raw iron until it softens, turns it on the anvil with practiced ease, then hammers it flat. Not too hard, not too soft. The rhythm is everything. Tap, turn, tap, fold, reheat. The cycle repeats over and over. The sound is calming in its constancy. Outside, warriors stretch, tie their horses, prepare for the day's drills or patrols. Some glance toward the forge. They will visit later. Always do. A rider approaches with a broken sword. The blade has split along the edge, too many impacts, too much haste in battle. The blacksmith nods, says little. He doesn't need to ask what happened. The fracture tells the story. He places the blade to the side. That will take time. For now, arrowheads, then nails, then the stirrup strap that snapped yesterday. He moves, quickly but without rushing. Every moment in the forge must be deliberate. Too slow, and the fire wastes. Too fast, and the iron resists. He shapes tools, weapons, horse fittings, cart fastenings, each with quiet precision. He sharpens blades with long, sweeping strokes across the whetstone, listening to the scrape, watching for burrs. The knife must sing when drawn. That's how he knows it's done. The sun climbs. Heat gathers under the forge roof. Sweat clings to his temples. His shirt darkens across the chest and back. He pauses to drink a leather pouch filled with weak fermented milk, just enough to ease the throat. Then he returns. The broken sword is next. He inspects the spine of the blade. If it's too cracked, it will fail again. If salvageable, he can reforge the edge. He sets it in the fire, waits, watches as it turns red, then orange, then nearly white. He removes it, lays it flat, and begins hammering. Each blow must follow the grain. Each strike must correct the weakness, not deepen it. He does not speak while he works. The forge is not a place for words. It is a place for listening to the metal, to the wind, to the pulse in one's own fingers. He hears the fire respond. To the bellows, the hiss of water as hot iron is plunged in, the ping of metal cooling too quickly. Each sound a signal. A young apprentice enters quietly, a boy of perhaps 12, new to the camp, not born Mongol, but absorbed. He carries a bent bridle ring, holds it out without words. The blacksmith nods, takes it, straightens it, hands it back. No lecture. The boy will learn by watching. Midday comes. He steps out briefly, stretches his back, eats a handful of dried meat, some flatbread, watches the herds move slowly across the grass, smells the stew cooking at a neighboring yurt. He does not linger. There is more to do now. A spear tip, then a cracked horseshoe, then a rivet for a saddle buckle. Each item carries its own importance. A failed strap can cost a rider his mount. A dull spear may not pierce through quilted armor. The blacksmith may not ride into battle, but his work does. In the afternoon, a chieftain visits. His blade is ceremonial, curved, ornate, rarely used. But he wants it polished, sharpened, oiled. It is more than weapon. It is status. The blacksmith receives it without ceremony, works carefully, cleans the inlay, restores the edge, wraps it in oiled cloth before returning it. The chieftain nods. Once, satisfied. No words exchanged. Later, the forge quiets. The boy apprentices sweep ash from the floor, organize tools. The bellows rest. The fire lowers, banked but not extinguished. Tomorrow it will rise again. The blacksmith inspects the finished work tools, lined neatly, blades wrapped, parts set aside. He checks the fire one last time, covers the iron stock, rubs his palms on his apron, then steps out. Evening now. The light is golden. Shadows stretch long. The camp murmurs with life. Children play. Warriors clean their gear. Dogs sniff around, cook fires. Somewhere, a marine corps plays a low, humming tune. The blacksmith walks slowly back to his yurt. His arms ache. His eyes sting from smoke. But it is a good ache. The ache of work, well done. Inside, his wife has prepared a simple meal. He eats quietly, listens to her tell of neighbors, of the child who lost a boot, of the away that wandered too far. He nods, says little. The forge still echoes in his ears. When sleep comes, it is heavy, dreamless. The muscles rest. The fingers twitch once, still remembering the hammer. The fire cools, but even in sleep, he is ready, because the camp moves, always moves, and wherever it goes, the forge will follow. He is not a warrior, not a noble, not a voice in the court, but he shapes the edge that guards the Khan. He builds the nail that holds the empire together, quietly, daily, without applause, and in the glow of firelight. That is enough. The smell of boiled mare's milk drifts faintly through the yurt, mingling with the dry scent of leather and wool. Outside, the wind combs gently across the grasslands, stirring dust and flicking the corners of felt flaps. Inside, a woman sits, beside a fire, slowly grinding what looks like dry lichen in a small stone bowl. Her hands are sure, her expression unreadable. A child lies nearby, flushed, bundled in a heavy quilt, his eyes only half open. He coughs once, then sighs. That's his medicine, Mongol style, not bound in scrolls, not practiced in stone-walled infirmaries, but embedded in memory, gesture, and the rhythms of the land. To speak of Mongol medicine is not to step into a world of precise instruments and codified knowledge. It is to step into a world of movement, adaptation, and necessity, where illness is treated not in isolation but in context within the warmth of a yurt, by those who know your body as well as they know the wind and sky, where healers are often women, sometimes shamans, occasionally learned men brought from distant cities, but more often they are someone's aunt, someone's brother, someone who has watched and remembered. There were few formal doctors among the Mongols themselves in the early days of the empire. Medicine, like everything else, was practical. Nomadic life did not allow for the accumulation of large pharmacies or permanent clinics. A remedy had to be portable, durable, drawn from what the steppe could offer. That often meant animal products: milk, fat, bone, skin. The fermented mare's milk, known as kumis, was more than a drink. It was believed to strengthen the stomach, aid digestion, restore strength to the weak. Even today, it remains a staple in traditional steppe medicine. Thick, sour, gently effervescent, it was both food and tonic. A sick man might drink it warm. A woman recovering from childbirth might mix it with a spoonful of powdered, dried organ meat. The taste wasn't the point. The effect was. Then there were fat's goat, fat for salves, sheep fat for poultices. Applied warm to the skin, they soothed aching joints and stiff backs. Melted, they were mixed with crushed herbs or bark, painted onto wounds, or massaged into cramping limbs. Even bone marrow was boiled down into broth, rich and savory, and fed to the very ill. Strength came from the herd, healing, too. Herbs were used but modestly. The steppe offered fewer medicinal plants than a forest or jungle. Still, healers knew the uses of wild onion, garlic chives, and rhubarb root. They knew how to collect saltwort and sedge, how to dry it for storage, grind it into powder, mix it into compresses. In the Gobi's harsh edges, some rare desert blooms were prized for their cooling effects, steeped in hot water, sipped slowly over the course of a day, for cuts and bruises. The solutions were simple: animal glue, beeswax, or leather strips. A gash might be washed with boiled water, then stitched crudely with horsehair or linen thread. No anesthetic, no antiseptic, just speed and pressure. Pain was not avoided, was endured. Bone setting was a respected skill. A dislocated shoulder, pulled back into place with a sharp twist and a short prayer. Broken leg, splinted with wood, bound with cloth, left to rest for weeks. The patient stayed indoors, warm, surrounded by fire and family. Recovery was slow and often incomplete. But in the open air of the steppe, survival mattered more than perfect healing. And always there were chants. The spiritual and the physical could not be separated. Mongol medicine often worked hand in hand with shamanic belief. Disease was sometimes seen not merely as imbalance, but as intrusion. A bad wind, a curse, an angry ancestor. In such cases, it was not enough to drink the tonic. A ceremony was needed. A bo'o, a shaman, male or female, would be summoned, dressed in layered robes, adorned with feathers, iron rings, and bells. The shaman would enter a trance. The fire would be fed. Drums would beat slow at first, then faster. Smoke curled from herbs tossed into the flames. The chant began, low and repetitive, a call to the spirits. The cause of the illness might be identified. A protective spirit might be invoked. The patient, eyes wide, would be still, hands gripped tightly in cloth. Healing came from negotiation, not just with the body, but with the unseen. These rites were not in conflict with the practical. They were part of it. To treat the fever and ignore the spirit was foolish, just as to burn incense without tending. The wound was negligent. Mongol medicine moved in both directions. As the empire expanded, so did its medical knowledge. The Mongols were quick to absorb. From conquered peoples, they took what worked. Persian physicians introduced them to Unani practices based on humoral theory and classical Greek ideas. Chinese doctors brought acupuncture, pulse diagnosis, and elaborate herbal prescriptions. Indian healers shared Ayurvedic insights. Mongol Khans often kept multilingual teams of medical advisors, each from a different background, each offering a different view of the body. These doctors wrote in multiple scripts. Some carried anatomical diagrams on silk scrolls. Others traveled with carved wooden models, teaching through touch. The Mongol elite, though often skeptical of ceremony, appreciated results. A doctor who could calm a fever, ease a childbirth, or prevent infection was welcome regardless of their gods or language. Hospitals were built in major cities. Kublai Khan established one in Dadu, with physicians assigned to care for the poor. Medical texts were translated into Mongolian. Pharmacists were trained in both folk and formal practices. For a time, under Yuan rule, Medicine flourished as a respected science, but most Mongols still lived far from cities. For them, healing remained rooted in the earth, the herd, and the sky. A sick child was not taken to a clinic. She was wrapped in blankets, given warm broth, sung to, watched carefully. A cough might be treated with melted butter and honey, a rash with a paste of ash and animal fat. If it grew worse, prayers were said. If it faded, thanks were given to the spirits, to the mother, to the land. There was a quiet wisdom in this, a sense of what the body needed, not in theory, but in practice: warmth, rest, soft food, belonging. Not everything worked. Infections took lives. Fevers sometimes could not be broken. Wounds festered. But in this world, death was not foreign. It walked closely, a companion. Medicine fought it, but never expected to win forever. And so the healer worked not for glory, not for wealth, but for continuity. She passed her knowledge, not in books, but in gestures. Showed her daughter how to read the eyes for illness. Taught her son when the cough meant trouble. Whispered the chant not to summon magic, but to calm the breath. Medicine was not a profession. It was inheritance. Tonight, as the wind settles outside the yurt and the child's fever breaks, the healer leans back, drinks the last of her warm broth, and rests. Tomorrow may bring another illness, another wound, but for now she has done enough. The fire crackles softly in the center of the yurt, casting long, warm shadows on the felt-covered walls. Outside, the wind pushes gently at the canvas, but the night is still. Inside, a monk and a mullah sit across from each other, sipping warm broth from wooden bowls. Neither speaks. Between them, a scroll lies unrolled, its script unfamiliar to both. But they are not here to read. They are here to be present, to coexist. This moment, a Christian and a Muslim, gathered in silence under a Mongol roof, was not only possible in the Mongol Empire. It was common dot among the many surprises that came with Mongol rule. Perhaps none was more confounding to outsiders than their attitude toward religion. Here was an empire born of blood and conquest, built on horseback, held together by swift force and relentless ambition. And yet, within this fierce machine, there was room for the sacred. Not just one sacred, all of them. The Mongols famously tolerated religion, not perfectly, not universally, but to a degree that astonished their contemporaries. In a world where Christian kings launched crusades, where Muslim rulers suppressed certain sects, where Buddhist dynasties persecuted rival schools, the Mongols, these so-called barbarians, welcomed nearly everyone. At the heart of this tolerance was a deep pragmatism. The Mongols themselves practiced a form of shamanism and animistic, spirit-centered belief system rooted in the steppe. Their world was alive with invisible forces: sky spirits, earth spirits, ancestor souls, animal guides. Shamans, called Bo'o, communicated with these forces through ritual, trance, and song. The Mongol word for the sky tengri was not just a physical dome overhead. It was a divine presence, eternal, watching. But Mongol shamanism was not jealous. It did not claim exclusive truth. It had no holy book, no missionary impulse, no desire to convert others. And so, when the empire expanded into Islamic lands, Christian kingdoms, Buddhist monasteries, did not clash with foreign gods. It simply made room for them. Genghis Khan himself set the tone, though firmly rooted in the shamanic traditions of the steppe. He recognized early on the value of religious figures. He exempted monks and clerics from taxation. He protected temples, churches, and mosques that cooperated with his armies. He even summoned religious leaders from across the empire to explain their faiths, not to debate, but to observe, to understand. Later, under Gedai Mangi, and especially Kublai Khan, this policy expanded into a deliberate strategy. In Karakoram, a Nestorian Christian church stood not far from a Buddhist stupa. A mosque sat beside a Taoist shrine. In the court of the great Khan, religious leaders debated cosmology, ethics, and ritual, not to compete, but to contribute. The Khan listened to all, and trusted none too deeply. This was not mere curiosity. It was governance by treating religions equally. The Mongols minimized dissent. By supporting temples, they gained access to literacy, record-keeping, and social stability. By tolerating foreign faiths, they encouraged trade, migration, and loyalty from diverse populations. A Muslim merchant from Bukhara could travel through Buddhist lands and reach a Nestorian Christian court official without fear of persecution. The empire became, in effect, a religious marketplace, and the Mongols were the regulators. Religious figures were expected to serve the state. In return for tax exemptions and protection, they provided services, record-keeping, education, healing, and prayer. Monasteries became centers of not only faith, but also administration. Religious leaders were often intermediaries between governors and the governed. Their authority came not from divinity alone, but from the concile. Among the tolerated were Nestorian Christians, a sect long considered heretical in the West, but deeply rooted in Central Asia. They found special favor with Mongol rulers, particularly in the early generations. Some royal women, including Sorgatani of Kublai Khan, were Christian. Nestorian clergy served as advisors, diplomats, and scribes. Buddhists, particularly from the Tibetan tradition, gained great influence under Kublai. Tibetan lamas were brought to court, given land, honored as spiritual guides. Buddhism became increasingly institutionalized in the Yuan dynasty, with state-sponsored temples and clerical hierarchies. Muslims played vital roles in administration, finance, and scholarship. Persian doctors, astronomers, and tax officials served in high posts. The Mongols respected Islam's intellectual traditions, but they also placed boundaries at times, restricting certain practices like halal slaughter or public calls to prayer, depending on local politics. Taoists were present, though their influence waxed and waned. They competed with Buddhists for imperial favor, particularly under Kublai. Some Mongol rulers admired Taoist alchemy and longevity teachings. Others viewed Taoist institutions as less useful than Buddhist or Muslim systems. Jews, Zoroastrians, Hindus, all existed within the empire, often in small communities. They were not persecuted. They were rarely elevated. They simply continued. What mattered most was not what one believed, but how one behaved. Rebellion was punished. Insulting the Khan was punished. Failure to pay taxes, refusal to serve, incitement. Too disordered, these were crimes. But praying to the wrong god, that was irrelevant. Yet this tolerance had its limits. If a religious group opposed Mongol rule or interfered with revenue collection, they lost protection. Taoist sects that denounced Buddhist rivals lost imperial funding. Muslim scholars who resisted certain reforms were sidelined. Christian clergy who tried to convert Mongol elites too aggressively were quietly dismissed. The Mongols wanted peace. On their terms, they were, in many ways, secular absolutists. The sacred could live so long as it bowed. And sometimes, Mongol rulers used religion strategically. Kublai Khan's embrace of Buddhism was not simply personal. It legitimized his rule over Chinese subjects. His patronage of Tibetan lamas created a loyal clerical class. His support for Confucian rituals reassured conservative officials. Like a rider with many reins, he held them all loosely, but firmly. Elsewhere, religious diplomacy unfolded. Envoys were sent to the Pope. Letters were exchanged with the Abbasid Caliph. Marriages arranged with Orthodox Christian nobility. The Mongol Empire had no single religion, but it had many religious faces, and each was shown when useful. Even Genghis Khan, whose policies were more pragmatic than personal, understood this. Power. It said that when a shaman once challenged his authority, declaring that the heavens favored another, Genghis had him executed. Not for the belief, but for the challenge. The gods could be many, but the ruler would be one. And so the empire endued its roads walked by monks, its markets filled with calls to prayer, its courts visited by pilgrims and priests alike. In this swirling mix, no one belief reigned, but all were present. Today, the legacy remains in the ruins of Karakoram. Archaeologists have found remnants of temples from multiple faith stones with crosses, Buddha statues, inscriptions in Arabic, Chinese, and Syriac. In historical records, we read of councils where lamas debated imams, of courts where astrologers and theologians were asked not to preach, but to explain. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of Mongol religious tolerance. A world where explanation was more valued than conversion, where the sacred was acknowledged, but not centralized, where belief flowed like trade freely, and with purpose. So tonight, as the fire dies low and the wind settles, picture a yurt somewhere near. Inside, a Buddhist monk lights a lamp. Across from him, a Sufi traveler opens his prayer beads. Outside, a child recites a prayer to Tengri, while his grandmother hums a Christian hymn from memory. No one stops them. No one demands one truth, because in this empire, belief is breathtaken in freely, and released without fear. The caravan moves slowly across the steppe, wheels creaking, camels groaning, horses snorting at invisible things in the wind. The sun is soft, almost kind, warming the wide plain, without scorching it. Dust swirls beneath the hooves, and banners flap above the wagon's silk threads trailing behind them like fading brushstrokes in the dry air. From a distance, the train looks ordinary. Traders, soldiers, scribes, bales of cotton, chests of spices, bundles of letters sealed with imperial marks. But somewhere among the wagons, packed tightly with bolts of fabric or sacks of flour, something else moves, quiet, unnoticed, unnamed. A flea, nestled in the fur of a rat, who clings to the floorboards of a supply cart. The rat does not know what it carries. The driver above does not hear its footsteps. But both of them, flea and rat, beast and manna, part of something much larger now, something invisible, something that has already begun. This is how the Black Death arrived, not with thunder, not with omens, but with silence, with motion, with the very networks that had made the Mongol Empire powerful. It began somewhere in the east, though no one is quite certain where. Perhaps in the warm, humid valleys of Yunnan in southern China, or in the rodent-rich plateaus of Central Asia. Wherever it began, it found what it needed: warm hosts, bustling trade routes, and an empire that stretched across the known world, stitched together by discipline, speed, and commerce. The Mongol Empire had, by the early 14th century, created an unprecedented level of connectivity. Couriers rode day and night across the Yam system. Merchants passed freely from Samarkand to Constantinople. Letters traveled from the Persian Gulf to Beijing. It was a triumph of logistics, of administration, of vision. But it also meant that nothing, not even death, was truly far away. The Plaguicenia pestis, though no one then knew its name, moved with this machinery, carried in fleas that lived on rats, carried in grain sacks, in bundles of fur, in tightly packed cargoes, aboard river barges and sea vessels. The rats traveled unnoticed, the fleas invisible, and the sickness waited, as all sickness does, for its moment. In the Mongol cities of China, the first signs appeared, strange swellings, fevers that came quickly and killed even faster, panic, rumors, families burning their dead, houses abandoned. But cities had always faced disease. At first, it was seen as local, tragic, but AINABL. Then it moved west, across the Gansu corridor, along the Silk Road, into the oases of Central Asia, through the merchant cities of the Chagatai Khanate. From there toward the Black Sea, the Mongols themselves were not spared. In camps, soldiers fell ill by the dozens. Horses stumbled, listless. The fires burned lower. Priests whispered prayers. Shamans beat their drums harder, trying to push the sickness back into the earth. But it did not listen. The air itself seemed wrong, thick, still, expectant. In 1346, Mongol forces laid siege to the port city of Kaffa, on the Crimean coast, then controlled by Genoese merchants. According to some chroniclers, the plague had already begun among the besieging Mongol troops. As they died, their bodies were allegedly flung over the city walls, launched like grotesque warnings from siege engines. The citizens of Kaffa panicked. Some fled by sea, heading west across the Mediterranean. They carried with them more than fear. From there, the plague spread into Europe, but its engine had already been primed across Asia. Caravan towns in Persia saw entire neighborhoods vanish. In cities like Tabriz and Baghdad, it was said that tens of thousands died in a single month. The dead were buried in shallow pits, sometimes not buried at all. Cats and dogs disappeared from the streets. Funerals became impossible. People died alone, in silence, with only the wind to hear them. But while the plague devastated regions, the Mongol system did not collapse immediately. Trade continued partially. Messages still moved, even if riders now carried cloths over their faces. Some khanates enforced quarantines. Others denied the plague's presence. There were no uniform policies. The empire, by now fractured into semi-independent realms, responded. Unevenly, some cities survived. Others vanished from maps entirely. In China, the Yuan dynasty ruled by Mongol emperors was already facing unrest. The plague accelerated its decline. Rebellions grew. Rice harvests failed. The mandate of heaven, it was whispered, had been withdrawn. In the west, the Ilkhanate in Persia crumbled, already weakened by dynastic struggles and economic decline. It now faced a population collapse. Entire towns lost their function. Irrigation systems fell into disrepair. Fields lay fallow, and yet beneath the devastation something strange persisted. The Mongol administrative habits endured. Local governors recorded deaths. Tax records were adjusted. Religious officials offered last rites, whether Muslim, Christian, or Buddhist. Caravanserais reopened, even if emptier now. The empire had taught its people how to move, how to adapt, and so they did. grief-stricken, but still moving. The Black Death would eventually claim as many as 75 million lives across Asia, Europe, and North Africa. It is impossible to count precisely. Records blur, graves disappear, names fade. But behind those numbers were traders and herders, scribes and soldiers, many of them Mongol subjects, or living in lands touched by Mongol conquest. And though the plague was not their creation, the Mongol infrastructure, roads, trade routes, administrative unity made its spread possible. The very success of the empire became its vulnerability. This is not to say the Mongols were to blame. Disease has always traveled with people, but it does mean that empires, especially successful, efficient ones, must carry both glory and burden. The same horses that brought silk to the west brought sorrow. The same ships that carried tea carried ruin. In some chronicles, the plague is called divine punishment, in others, a test. In some stories, a demon that rode with the wind. In Mongol belief, it may have been a spirit unseen, disrespected, angry, but in every story, it was relentless. And yet, the world did not end. It changed. Populations declined, yes. Cities fell silent, but new powers emerged. Survivors rebuilt. Routes shifted. The Silk Road slowed, but did not die. The memory of the Mongol Empire lingered not just in ruins or archives, but in the bones of roads, in the scripts of bureaucrats, in the quiet knowledge that all things empires, illnesses, even grief move. Tonight, as the wind carries softly across your window, imagine one of those plague riders, wrapped in thick wool, face hidden, hands gloved, a pouch of letters at their side. Beneath them, a horse tired but loyal. Behind them, a city already coughing. Ahead, a town not yet afraid. They ride not with malice, but with duty. They do not know what they carry. They do not need to. There is no thunder, no trumpet, no great act of rebellion, no single battle to mark the fall. Instead, there is only a quiet unraveling thread by thread, law by law, year by year. The Ilkhanate does not collapse like a wall. It fades like a caravan track swallowed. By shifting sand to understand how the Ilkhanate disappeared, we must first understand how it began. When Genghis Khan's forces thundered westward in the early 13th century, they reached as far as the Iranian plateau and the Fertile Crescent. His grandson, Hulagu, was tasked with extending Mongol authority over Persia, Mesopotamia, and surrounding lands. In Iten Lambai Wushalo, Hulagu led a massive campaign toppling the Nizari Ismaili strongholds in the mountains of northern Iran, and just 2 years later, destroying the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. The city, once a center of knowledge and power, was left in ruins. A shock to the Islamic world, a warning to others, and in that vacuum, the Ilkhanate was born. Ilkhan, literally subordinate Khan, was the title Hulagu adopted, though. Nominally under the Great Khan's authority in Mongolia, the Ilkhanate quickly became functionally independent. It stretched across much of modern Iran, Iraq, parts of Turkey, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and beyond. The cities of Tabriz, Maraga, and later Sultania became centers of administration, culture, and political gravity. At its height, the Ilkhanate was a place of contrast and complexity. On one hand, it bore all the trademarks of Mongol governance mobile: armies, meritocratic promotions, multilingual bureaucracy, and a surprisingly flexible attitude toward local customs. On the other, it quickly absorbed the traditions of Persian administration. Persian scribes filled court records. Islamic jurists advised on civil law. The Mongols did not destroy the Persian state. They rode into it and, over time, became part of it. For a while, it worked. Peace returned to many cities. Trade flourished. Canals were repaired. Markets reopened. Hulagu and his successors, including Abukar, Ghazan, and Eljaitu, supported scholarship. They welcomed astronomers and theologians. They collected books, funded observatories, translated texts from Greek and Sanskrit, built grand mausoleums with domes of turquoise and tile. But beneath this veneer of stability, cracks were forming. The first was dynastic. Hulagu's line ruled directly for less than a century. After the death of Abu Said Bahadur Khan in 1335, last effective Ilkhan with unchallenged authority, no clear successor emerged. He left no male heir, and suddenly the throne became a prize, not a role. Pretenders rose. Some claimed descent from Genghis. Others did not even try. Local warlords, governors, and tribal chieftains each began asserting their own authority. Power fragmented into pieces too small to count, too weak to hold. But dynastic fragility alone does not dissolve a state. The second crack came from within the administration. With central power uncertain, regional governors, called emirs, began withholding taxes or redirecting them. Some stopped sending reports to the capital. Others stopped acknowledging it altogether. The bureaucracy, once the pride of the Ilkhanate, faltered. Scribal work slowed. Roads became less safe. Courts delayed rulings. Justice grew inconsistent. In the cities, life continued cautiously. Merchants still opened stalls. Artisans still worked their kilns. But travelers whispered of new tolls, of bribes requested, of judges replaced overnight. The empire, once a reliable structure, became a mosaic of provisional arrangements. A tax collector might hold authority in one village and be turned away in the next. Then came the third crack-famine in the mid-14th century. A series of poor harvests swept across the region. Droughts, dried rivers, locusts devoured what little was planted. Grain prices soared. Livestock weakened. Entire provinces strained under scarcity. And famine, as always, invited other miseries: banditry, migration, unrest. The Ilkhanate lacked the cohesion to respond. Where once governors might have coordinated relief, now they eyed each other with suspicion. Some hoarded food. Others tried to enforce price controls. But there was no unified effort. People began to flee the worst-hit areas. Cities strained to support the influx. Disease followed, quiet and unrelenting, and through it all, religion, tolerated with Mongol aloofness, became a tool of politics. Early Ilkhans had been Buddhist, Christian, or shamanic in faith. But Genghis Khan, in the late 13th century, converted to Islam and made it the official religion of the court. His conversion was genuine, but it was also strategic. Islam was the dominant faith of the region. Aligning with it helped stabilize his rule, but it also shifted the religious dynamics of the empire. Now, rival claimants to the throne began using religion to justify rebellion. A Sunni general might denounce a Shia governor. A Sufi order might declare a certain emir illegitimate. Faith, once a bridge across communities, became a wedge. Into this chaos stepped new actors. In Anatolia, the Ottoman Beylik was rising. To the east, the Timurids would soon emerge. Local dynasties, like the Jalurids, Chabonids, and Muzaffarids, established rule over former Ilkhanid territories. Some claimed loyalty to the Ilkhanate in name. Others ignored it completely. And yet, for a time, the Ilkhanate still existed in parchment, if not in practice. Coins were minted in its name. Friday prayers still mentioned the Ilkhan documents, bore the royal seal, but these were the shadows of empire, signs of a past authority, not a present one. Gradually, even these vanished. There was no official end date, no treaty, no final battle, just a long, slow forgetting by the late 14th century. Travelers passing through Persia no longer spoke of the Ilkhanate. They spoke of local rulers, of city-states, of tribal confederacies. The Mongol legacy remained in language, in architecture, in law, but the name itself had grown faint. Today, the ruins of Ilkhanid cities remain minarets, domes, tile mosaics. Some buildings were repurposed, others abandoned. In Tabriz, the once grand palaces are now stones beneath gardens and schools. The Mongol burial grounds outside Sultania lie quiet, their inscriptions weathered but still legible to those who know what to look for. So what does it mean for an empire to disappear? Not with violence, not with spectacle, but with forgetting, with silence, with the weight of ordinary people choosing to live under someone new, rather than die for someone fading. It means records that stop mid-sentence, buildings left half-finished, coins that stop circulating, names that slowly shift in dialect until they are no longer remembered at all. The Ilkhanate did not collapse, it dissolved, and perhaps that is how most things end, not with a scream, but with a breath. Tonight, as the stars appear over the high plateaus of Iran, think of that empire once so feared, so intricate, so vast, now gone except in dust and memory. Its laws no longer enforced, its name a whisper, but its shape influence still felt in the bones of cities, in the ink of forgotten scrolls, in the quiet wisdom of those who knew how to govern the ungovernable. No empire lasts forever, but some do not fall. They simply cease to be noticed. There was no proclamation, no universal signal that the Mongol Empire had ended. No messenger rode across the steppes announcing the last day of the Khans. No city held a funeral for the empire. No child etched the date in the dirt and said, "This is the moment it was over." Instead, it was quieter than that, slower, like the setting of the sun behind low mountains, unnoticed by the busy hands of those still at work. From the ground, from the perspective of the herder, the merchant, the cook, the caravan driver, the fall of the Mongol Empire was not a collapse. It was a gradual dimming, a quiet rearrangement of how things were done, of whom to obey, of where to send the taxes. The campfires still lit each evening, the horses still needed water, the road still stretched out across the land, etched by years of movement and memory. But the riders who once brought orders from distant courts came less frequently. The seals on the letters they carried became unfamiliar, and in time they stopped coming altogether. By the mid-14th century, the once mighty empire had splintered into fragments: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in the western steppes. Each still called itself Mongol. Each still traced its lineage to Genghis Khan. But the unity that had once connected them by messenger, by oath, by fear, was gone. And yet, to the average person, the question was never what happened to the empire. It was always who is in charge here now. In the northern pastures, a shepherd might notice that the tax collector now spoke a different dialect, or that the tribute was demanded not in silver, but in livestock. In the cities, the Khan's edicts began to vary, from region to region, sometimes contradicting one another. Guilds and merchants adjusted without protest. They had learned, long ago, to survive by bending to the trader on the Silk Road. The empire's end was marked not by rebellion, but by delays. Way stations that once offered food and shelter stood empty. Guards that once protected the road no longer appeared. Bandits crept out of forgotten valleys, testing the silence. The speed that had defined the Mongol system, the certainty of movement, the promise that a letter could reach the edge of the world in days began to slow. A merchant might have waited days at a checkpoint where once he passed in hours. A caravan might have had to hire extra guards, pay bribes at city gates, or choose longer, more circuitous routes. The road was still there. The empire, technically, still existed. But the rhythm had changed. Even the sounds changed. In the great cities of the empire, once humming with many tongues, traders from Venice brushing past scholars from Delhi, the bustle began to fade. Languages drifted back into regional silos. Court musicians who once played for Mongol Khans now performed for new rulers, local dynasts, sultans, rising emperors. The laughter of children in the market remained, but the caravan bells were fewer. In Karakoram, once the heart of the empire, grass began to reclaim the stone, not in a dramatic wave, but patiently growing between cracks, pushing against unused thresholds. The artisans who once supplied the Khan's court moved elsewhere. The blacksmiths stopped forging ceremonial swords. Scrolls curled in dusty corners of disused temples. The city did not burn. It simply ... quieted, and in the villages, life went on. The grandmother, weaving by the fire, still taught her granddaughter the same lullabies. The farmer still rose with the sun, adjusted the yoke on his oxen, and walked into the same fields. The baker still shaped bread the way his father had, heating the same clay oven, whispering the same prayers for steady hands. The Mongol Empire had shaped their world. Its laws had reached into their kitchens, its couriers had passed their doors, its taxes had weighed on their harvests. But now all of that became background, a memory still vivid to the old, but fading for the young. The empire had always been an idea held together by motion, by riders, by messages, by fear and favor. It had never been defined by a single capital, a single language, or even a single religion. Its power was in its connections, the way it reached across deserts, mountains, and rivers without faltering. But once those connections frayed, what was left? The empire's symbols still remained. Coins still bore the names of Khans long dead. Some city gates still had Mongol carvings above them. A few laws, particularly those related to trade and inheritance, persisted in local codes. And many rulers, long after the empire was functionally gone, still claimed Mongol ancestry. Even Tamerlane, who rose decades later in Central Asia, styled himself a restorer of Genghis Khan's order, even as he built his own. But that order was gone. It had not been defeated in a single campaign. It had not crumbled under the weight of rebellion. It had simply lived to long past its moment, past its energy, past the generation that had believed in it most. From the ground, from the people who tilled and traded and traveled, the end of the Mongol Empire looked like an old story being told less often, like a grandfather's tale that no longer felt urgent, like a flag left hanging long after the garrison had moved on. And yet, echoes remained in the way borders were drawn, in the use of paper currency, in the lingering respect for written law, for efficient roads, for cosmopolitan cities. The Mongols had left more than ashes. They had left habits. A merchant in Samarkand might still seal a contract in triplicate, as had been done under Mongol rule. A judge in Tabriz might still quote passages from the Yasa, the Mongol code of laws. A post station on a remote road might still be called Yam, even if no Khan used it. And in the grasslands, elders still told stories of the days when horses moved like wind, when a single Khan ruled the lands from the Pacific to the Black Sea, of punishments swift and justice impartial, of golden tents and iron discipline. These tales were not always accurate, but they were steady. They reminded people that once order had been possible, even if that order was no longer present. Tonight, as you rest beneath quiet skies, think of a rider crossing the plains long after the empire's peak. He is tired. The horse moves steadily, but not fast. The stars above him are the same ones Genghis Khan once rode under. But the letters in his pouch are not from a Khan. They are from a merchant to his cousin, from a father to a distant son. Simple messages, no longer part of a great system, just human threads tying people together. The rider is not sad. He does not speak of lost empires. He rides because he must, because people still need to speak, to share, to connect, and that, in the end, is what survives. The wind has quieted now. The fires that once blazed along the steppe have become embers. The hammer falls silent in the blacksmith's tent. The messengers have delivered their letters. The camp attendants have hung their worn saddles. And somewhere in the distance, where grass sways gently in the starlight, an old yurt creaks as it settles into the earth. You've traveled far through the kitchens of goat boiling, servants and the silken halls of Mongol princesses, past burned cities and into glittering yurts, alongside horses and inside the mines of Khans. You've walked the ruins of Karakoram and followed the plague into empty homes. You've traced the fall of forgotten states and listened to the silence where empires once thundered. And what did you find? Not just conquest, not just glory or terror, but rhythm, a rhythm of rising with the sun and tending to horses, a rhythm of making, mending, feeding, burying, a rhythm that stretched from the Mongol campfires to the edge of the known world, carried not by kings, but by those whose names are lost to history. The woman stirring broth, the scribe copying a decree by lamplight, the boy running messages between tents. These were the soul of the empire, even when the Khans themselves could no longer hold it together. History remembers Genghis Khan and the cities he took, but sleep comes from quieter things, from the gentle clinking of stirrups, from the low hum of chants in the dark, from the slow fade of one's great laws into local customs, still obeyed though no one remembers why. Perhaps that's the truest legacy of the Mongols, not in what they conquered, but in what they connected. People, roads, ideas, faiths. The traces are still there, not always visible, but if you listen, you'll hear them in the way a traveler asks directions, or in how two strangers barter in a shared language, or in the silence of a forgotten shrine by a broken trade road. Empires end, but stories remain. And now, your journey through this one is ending too. Let the yurts close. Let the horses rest. Let the coins of the past fall quiet in your palm. You've walked across a world of wind and wool, stone and shadow. And now it's time to lay it all down. Breathe in and let the empire drift away, like dust in twilight, like hoofbeats fading into sleep.